Hi my dear students, welcome to my biology class. Today we are going to learn the introduction of the chapter, The World of Living. When we look around, we can see both living things and non-living things. But the living world is so wonderful. The living types are not only numerous but also amazing. We can see wide varieties of plants and animals around us. They interact each other, they live peacefully on the nature. Now let's discuss the characteristic features of these living things, and from these characteristic features let us pick up some defining properties of the living. So finally we will try to define the term living or life. Then our topic is what is living, what are the characteristic features as well as the defining properties of living. What is living? So let's discuss the characteristic features of living things at first. There are certain distinct characteristic features exhibited by living things which distinguish the living things from the non-living things. So which are the common characteristics occurred in the living things? Those characteristics are, first of all, growth. Next one, reproduction. Third one is metabolism. Fourth characteristic feature is cellular organization. Fifth one, consciousness. Sixth one, birth. Next one, death. Next, lifespan. Ninth one, self-replication. Tenth one, self-regulation. And 11th one, evolution. Here I have written some important characteristic features of living things. Then let's discuss about each characteristic feature and understand whether they can be used as the defining properties of the living things or only they exist as the characteristic property. Growth. All living things grow, all living things reproduce, they show metabolism, they have cellular organization, they are conscious about their environment, they have both birth and death, they have lifespan, they are able to self-replicate, they are self-regulating organisms or units. Let's take each characteristic property of the living things and understand whether it is a defining property or a characteristics of the living things. So first of all, growth. What is growth? Do living organisms grow? It is the increase in mass and increase in number of the cells. Increase in mass and increase in number of the cell. All living organisms exhibit this property, this characteristic feature. They all grow by cell division. All living organisms exhibit this property, the characteristic feature. Here, increase in mass means the cell acquires more amount of protoplasm so that it enlarges in size. It can be seen in the body parts of living organisms. increase in number of the cell means one cell divides into two. See, one cell divides into two, then two cells into four. This way the cell number is increasing during cell division. So that's the meaning of growth. By the division of the cell, growth occurs both in plants and animals. But the pattern of the growth is different in plants and animals. Plants grow throughout the life, while the animals grow only up to certain period of their age. However, growth of certain kind of tissues may happen in the body of living organism to replace the lost cells. So, did you get it? What is the difference between the growth in plants and animals? Now, let's consider the increase in mass. When we think about the non-living things also can grow. For example, a mountain. More substances can be added to the mountain externally. So here the growth happens externally from the external surroundings, external environment. So that is also growth. So non-living things also exhibit growth. Living things also exhibit growth. In living things, growth takes place from inside by cell division and also by increase in cell mass. So do you get the difference? As non-living things exhibit the feature growth, it cannot be considered as the defining property of the living. It is one of the characteristic features of the living. So growth is one of the characteristic features of the living things. The next characteristic feature is reproduction. What is reproduction? The process of producing young ones by their parents. Living organisms reproduce both sexually and asexually. Let's consider unicellular organisms. First of all, we are going to think about unicellular organisms. For example, amoeba and bacteria. How do they reproduce? By binary fission. Suppose the amoeba is a single-celled organism. It divides its body in two. It forms two daughter amoebae. So it reproduces by binary fission. It is one of the asexual method of reproduction that is seen among small or lower group of organisms. So when we consider the unicellular reproduction, the reproduction is synonymous with growth. In these organisms, the growth is also cell division. A single cell divides into two daughter cells. That is growth. Then when we consider the criterion cell division for growth, it is growth. When we consider the reproduction unicellular organism, it is also reproduction. So, reproduction is synonymous with the growth in the case of unicellular organism. So, let's think about multicellular organisms like humans and animals including plants. They also reproduce both sexually and asexually. Not about human beings, that some plants reproduce asexually also. Some animals reproduce asexually also. Lower group of animals reproduce asexually also. Then can we consider the reproduction as the defining property of the living, or is it one of the characteristic property of the living things? Of course, it is one of the characteristic features of the living. It is not the defining property. Why? Because there are some living organisms that cannot reproduce themselves. A few examples of infertile organisms are mule, sterile worker honeybees, sterile worker honeybee, infertile human couple, infertile human couple. Mule is the combination of male donkey with a female horse. It is a sterile one. It cannot produce the young ones. The next one, sterile worker honeybees. These are female sterile worker honeybees. The responsibility of these worker honeybees to collect the nectar from the flowers. The third one, infertile human couple. Some human beings are unable to produce the gametes in their body. so that they cannot produce the young ones. So these are some examples of the sterile living organisms. As there are sterile living organisms among the creatures, among the living things, we cannot consider reproduction as one of the defining properties of the living. It can be considered as one of the characteristic features of the living. The next characteristic feature is metabolism. Do you know what is metabolism? It is the sum total of chemical reactions that take place in the living body to maintain the living state. There are several biomolecules in the living system. For example, nucleic acids like DNA, RNA, proteins, carbohydrates, fat, lipids, all those are biomolecules. A lot of products, that means chemical compounds, have been producing in the living body. Both production and breakdown of complex substances are being taken place in the body of living organisms. All those reactions are true living reactions. Chemical reactions in the living system are true living reactions. So this type of true living reactions can be seen only in the living system. It cannot be seen in the non-living system. So when we do some chemical reactions in the laboratory, those are non-living reactions. That is not taken place in the living body. But when we consider in vitro reactions, those are not living things, but they are living reactions. Here we can choose the metabolism as one of the defining properties of the living. Why? Metabolism can be occurred only in the living system, not in the non-living system. We cannot observe the living reactions in the non-living things. So it is one of the defining properties. It can be considered as both the characteristic feature and the defining property. Another important characteristic feature is cellular organization of the body. Cellular organization. We all know that cell is the fundamental unit of life. A cell is able to perform all the life activities. Cell is the basic unit of life. A cell divides to form numerous cells. It is known as tissue. Then various tissues together form an organ, then to organ system, and finally an organism. So this cellular organization is seen only in the living things. The cell, tissues, organs, organ systems, all organ systems together make an organism. This pattern is seen only in the living things. It is not visible in the non-living things. So, cellular organization can be considered as one of the defining properties of the living. It can be considered as both the characteristic feature and the defining property. The next characteristic feature is consciousness. It is the ability to sense the environment. Ability to sense the environment. All living organisms are aware about their surroundings. They respond to various stimuli. Stimuli like light, temperature, pressure, touch, and so on. A stimuli can be either physical, chemical, or biological. So all living organisms exhibit this consciousness. When we think about human beings, we are the only living organisms exhibit self-consciousness. This consciousness or self-consciousness cannot be seen in the non-living things. So it can be considered as one of the defining properties of living. So it is one of the characteristic features as well as the defining properties of living. When we think about a person lying in coma stage, does the person respond to the stimuli? Of course, the person do not show any response. to the external stimulus. But when we give injection or medicines to the patient, the body of the patients respond to the particular medicine. So we can say that coma patients do not respond to the stimuli. That is also an exceptional case when we consider the consciousness. Anyway, their body is able to respond to the stimuli. So we can surely say that consciousness is one of the defining properties of living. What are the other features that I have told you just before about the living things? The lifespan, birth, death, then self-replication, self-regulation, evolution. All these features can be seen in the living organisms only. So, self-regulation, self-replication and evolution are also, of course, the defining properties of living. Now, let's define the term living. Here we have discussed about a few characteristic features of living things. Out of these, which are the defining properties of living? First one, consciousness. Next one, cellular organization. Third, metabolism. Self-replication. Self-regulation and evolution. So these are most suitable for defining the term life. What are living things? I can simply say that living organisms are self-replicating, evolving and self-regulating interactive system that are capable of responding to the external stimuli. Today, we have learned about the characteristic features as well as defining properties of the living thing, and also we tried to define the term living by using those defining properties. I hope you understood the topic well. With this, I conclude my session. Then thank you and have nice moments.